In the sweltering summer of 1942, as the world was engulfed in war, Second Lieutenant Isaac Taylor, a gifted pilot of the famed Tuskegee program, climbed into the cockpit of his P-40 Warhawk and flew into the dense, subtropical jungle of northern Florida. He was never seen again. A cursory search, hampered by the era's technology and clouded by the pervasive racism of a segregated military, was quickly concluded. The official report, a stain on a hero's record, cited pilot error, a convenient fiction that closed the case on a missing black airman. For 50 years, that was the story. A quiet injustice buried in a dusty file, leaving a sister to nurse a private, unprovable suspicion. The jungle, like the bureaucracy, kept its silence. Then, in 1992, a logging company surveying a remote, inaccessible tract of the Apalachicola National Forest found the impossible: the rusted, vine-choked wreckage of a World War II fighter plane, swallowed by the swampy earth. The discovery resurrected a ghost and launched a modern military investigation into a 50-year-old mystery. The subsequent forensic excavation would uncover a truth far darker than simple negligence. Bullet holes in the fuselage and a forged supply manifest hidden in the cockpit would reveal that Isaac Taylor was not the victim of an accident, but of a cold-blooded murder, a crime orchestrated to protect a treasonous secret and silenced for half a century by the deep-seated rot of prejudice. Before I begin, thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it there? It really means a lot to know you're here with us. We're in this together. Now, let me tell you what really happened. The mail arrived at Howard University's women's dormitory with the predictable, comforting rhythm of wartime life. For Lena Taylor, a brilliant and fiercely determined chemistry student, the highlight of any week was the thin, airmail envelope bearing the postmark of the Tuskegee Army Airfield. Her older brother, Isaac, was her hero, his every achievement a source of profound, almost personal pride. He was not just a pilot, he was a pioneer, a living embodiment of the Double V campaign, a warrior fighting for victory over fascism abroad and for the simple, long-denied dignity of being seen as an equal at home. On this humid afternoon in late July, she took his latest letter to her favorite spot, a quiet bench under the shade of a large oak on the campus green. She slit the envelope carefully, as she always did, and unfolded the single, precious sheet of paper. Isaac's handwriting was like his personality, neat, confident, and with a stylish, forward-slanting energy. The first part of the letter was filled with his usual news details of his training, his pride in the P-40 Warhawk he was now flying, his frustration with the endless, demeaning slights of the segregated military. He wrote of the superior flying skills of his fellow Tuskegee airmen and the quiet, burning determination they all shared to prove their worth in the crucible of combat. But it was the final paragraph that made Lena pause, a sudden, dissonant chord in an otherwise familiar melody. He was writing from a temporary posting at Dale Mabry Field in Tallahassee, a base where he was ferrying new planes for other pilots to train in. "This place is different from Tuskegee," he wrote. "There's a rot here, something in the supply depot that smells worse than the swamp. It's not the enemy in front of you that's the problem, Lena. It's the one standing behind you." Some folks see this war as a business, a chance to get rich while good men are dying. I've seen things, Lena. Things that don't add up. We'll tell you when I see you next week. Don't worry. I'm watching my six. Lena read the paragraph again, a prickle of unease disturbing the warm afternoon. It was cryptic, unlike him. Isaac was direct, a man who faced problems head-on. This coded language, this hint of a hidden danger, was unsettling. A rot. A business. What had he seen? She folded the letter, the strange, ominous words echoing in her mind. She told herself she was overreacting. Isaac was a careful man, a skilled pilot. He would be home in a week, and he would explain everything then. The week passed in a blur of organic chemistry equations and anxious, unanswered questions. On the day he was due to arrive in Washington, D.C., and on leave, Lena found herself unable to concentrate, her eyes constantly drifting to the clock. her ears straining for the sound of the telephone. The call never came. The knock on the door of her family's small, neat row house in the Ledroit Park neighborhood came the following evening. Lena was in the kitchen with her mother, the familiar, comforting smell of baking bread filling the air. Her father answered the door. Through the doorway, Lena saw them. 2 white army officers. Their faces scrubbed clean of all emotion. Their uniforms immaculate. They held their caps in their hands in that formal, terrible way that needed no explanation. Her mother's hand flew to her mouth, a small, strangled gasp escaping her lips. Lena felt the world tilt, the warm, safe kitchen suddenly a cold, airless space. She stood frozen as the 2 officers stepped inside, their polished shoes silent on the worn wooden floor. The senior officer, a major, spoke in a low, practiced monotone, his words a series of perfectly modulated, soul-destroying blows. "Mr. and Mrs. Taylor, I am Major Harris. This is Lieutenant Cross. We are here on behalf of the Secretary of War. It is my deepest regret to inform you that your son, Second Lieutenant Isaac Taylor, has been reported missing." He continued to speak, but the words became a meaningless drone in Lena's ears. Ferry flight from Tuskegee to Dale Mabry Field encountered severe weather over northern Florida, failed to arrive. An extensive search is underway. She heard the word missing, but in the funereal gravity of the officer's demeanor, she knew it was a euphemism. Her father, a man of immense, quiet dignity who had worked 2 jobs to send his children to college, stood ramrod straight, his face a mask of stone. Her mother began to weep, a low, keening sound of pure, maternal anguish. But Lena felt a different emotion rising through the shock and the grief. It was a cold, sharp, and terrible suspicion. It wasn't the weather. It wasn't an accident. She thought of the letter, hidden safely in a box in her room. A rot. "I've seen things." The 2 officers, with their talk of storms and lost planes, were telling a story. And Lena Taylor knew, with a certainty that would settle in her soul and remain there for the next 50 years, that it was a lie. The official search for Second Lieutenant Isaac Taylor was an exercise in bureaucratic procedure, an operation more concerned with appearances than with actual discovery. The POV shifts to the base commander of Dale Mabry Field in Tallahassee, a portly, balding colonel named Frank Patterson. Patterson was a career officer, a man more adept at navigating the politics of the Army Air Forces than the treacherous, subtropical wilderness that surrounded his base. The disappearance of a Tuskegee pilot was, to him, primarily an administrative headache, a potential blemish on his command record. The search was launched 24 hours after Isaac's P-40 Warhawk failed to arrive. It was, on paper, a comprehensive effort. A handful of B-25 bombers, their bomb bays empty, were dispatched to fly lazy, high-altitude grid patterns over the vast, impenetrable expanse of the Apalachicola National Forest, a sprawling wilderness of dense pine forests, cypress swamps, and blackwater rivers. The pilots, all white, strained to see through the triple canopy jungle, a task akin to finding a single green needle in a haystack of infinite green. On the ground, the effort was even more cursory. A few dozen infantrymen, grumbling about the heat and the snakes, were trucked to the edge of the forest and ordered to conduct a line search along a few of the main logging tracks. They moved through the humid, insect-infested woods with a distinct lack of urgency, their hearts not in a mission they privately considered a waste of time. Colonel Patterson's primary source of information, and the man who would become the chief architect of the official narrative, was Staff Sergeant Leland Galloway. Galloway was the NCO in charge of the base supply depot, a man whose bland, by-the-book exterior concealed a deep-seated, virulent racism and a shrewd, calculating mind. He was the first person Patterson summoned for a report, as he had been on duty when Lieutenant Taylor had refueled before the final fatal leg of his flight. "Tell me about the pilot, Sergeant," Patterson said, sitting behind his large mahogany desk, a symbol of a command far removed from the realities of the swamp. Galloway stood at a rigid, respectful attention, his face a mask of professional concern. "He was a cocky one, sir. One of the Tuskegee boys. You know how they are." Seemed like he was in a real hurry. I told him a storm was brewing up north, that he might want to wait it out. He just laughed it off, said his Warhawk could handle a little rain. This was a complete fabrication. Isaac had never spoken to Galloway, but it was a perfect, insidious lie. A piece of testimony that played directly into the prevailing prejudices of the era. It painted a picture of a young, arrogant black pilot, overconfident in his abilities, dismissive of the advice of a seasoned, white NCO. Did he conduct a proper pre-flight check? Patterson asked, already knowing the answer Galloway would give. Didn't look like it to me, sir, Galloway replied, shaking his head with a feigned sadness. He just seemed to want to get in the air, kicked the tires, gave the plane a quick walk around, and climbed in. I don't think he even checked his fuel sump for water. After the rain we had that morning, that's a real risk. Galloway's testimony was a masterpiece of character assassination, delivered with a veneer of reluctant, professional duty. He was providing Patterson with exactly what he needed, a plausible explanation for the crash that placed the blame squarely on the shoulders of the missing pilot. It was a narrative that required no further investigation, no uncomfortable questions about the quality of the aircraft or the training of the pilots. It was simple, it was clean, and it fit the racist worldview of the time. As the days of the fruitless search ticked by, Galloway's story became the accepted truth around the base. It was repeated in the officers' club, in the mess hall, in the barracks. The disappearance of Isaac Taylor was not a mystery. It was an inevitability, the predictable outcome of giving a complex, powerful machine to a man who was, in their view, inherently inferior. The search was no longer about finding a lost airman. It was about confirming a prejudice. The jungle, with its vast, impenetrable silence, became a willing accomplice. Its failure to yield any wreckage seen as a confirmation of the plane's violent, error-induced demise. The narrative was set before the search had even truly begun. After 5 days, Colonel Patterson officially called off the search. The decision was met with no resistance, only a quiet, collective sense of relief among the men who had been tasked with the half-hearted effort. The jungle had not yielded a single piece of wreckage, a fact that Patterson now used to cement the official narrative. The violence of the crash, he argued in his preliminary report, was so total that the aircraft had likely disintegrated on impact, leaving nothing large enough to be spotted from the air. The final phase of the investigation was the formal inquiry, a proceeding that was little more than a bureaucratic rubber stamp. The inquiry board consisted of 3 white officers, all from Patterson's command. They met for a single afternoon in a stuffy conference room. Their primary and only witness was Staff Sergeant Leland Galloway. Galloway, dressed in his immaculate Class A uniform, repeated his story with a somber, convincing gravity. He recounted his fabricated conversation with Lieutenant Taylor, his tone one of a seasoned NCO who had tried his best to advise a reckless young pilot. He detailed the skipped pre-flight checks, the dismissive attitude towards the weather, the arrogant belief that the P-40 Warhawk was invincible. "It's a tragedy, sir," he concluded, his eyes downcast. "But in my professional opinion, it was an avoidable one." The board listened, nodding sympathetically. They did not question his testimony. They did not ask for corroborating witnesses. They did not investigate the possibility of mechanical failure, a common occurrence in the heavily used training aircraft of the era. Galloway's story was too convenient, too perfectly aligned with their own preconceived notions to be subjected to any real scrutiny. The final accident report was a model of bureaucratic efficiency, a 2-page document that sealed Isaac Taylor's fate and forever tarnished his legacy. The report's conclusion was stark and unequivocal. The board finds that the loss of aircraft and pilot was the result of pilot error. Second, Lieutenant Isaac Taylor, demonstrating a negligent disregard for established flight safety protocols and acting contrary to the advice of experienced ground personnel, flew his aircraft into a severe weather system for which it was not equipped. It is the conclusion of this board that Lieutenant Taylor's inexperience and overconfidence were the primary contributing factors in this tragic and preventable incident. The report was sent up the chain of command, where it was signed and filed away. Isaac Taylor, a man who had overcome the immense barriers of a racist society to become one of its elite aviators, was now officially blamed for his own death. His name was added to the long, sad list of non-combat casualties, but with an asterisk of shame beside it. He was not a hero who had been lost. He was a failure who had proven the bigots right. A form letter was sent to the Taylor family, a cold, impersonal document that informed them the search had been concluded and that their son was presumed killed in the line of duty. It offered the nation's condolences but provided no details, no answers, only the sterile finality of a closed case. For Colonel Patterson, the matter was finished. The administrative headache had been resolved. For Staff Sergeant Galloway, it was a perfect crime. He had not only silenced the one man who had discovered his treasonous black market operation, but he had used the very system of prejudice that he embodied to make the murder look like an accident and the victim look like the culprit. He had wrapped the truth in a shroud of racist assumptions and buried it in a government file. The jungle held the wreckage, the files held the lie. And for the next 50 years, the two secrets would remain undisturbed, locked away in their respective prisons of mud and paper. The official story was now history. A small, ugly footnote in the annals of a segregated army. 50 years. A half-century is long enough for the world to be remade. The segregated military that Isaac Taylor had served in was a distant, shameful memory, dismantled by executive order. The civil rights movement had risen and crested, forever altering the landscape of American society. The Cold War had been fought and won. Man had walked on the moon. The world of 1992 was a place that would have been, in many ways, unrecognizable to the young pilot who had vanished in 1942. For Dr. Lena Taylor, the 50 years had been a lifetime of quiet, relentless achievement. She had earned her doctorate in chemistry from Columbia, had become a respected professor at her alma mater, Howard University, and had published groundbreaking research in the field of polymer science. She had married, raised a son who was now a successful lawyer, and lived a life of intellectual rigor and quiet dignity. She was a woman who believed in the power of evidence, in the elegant, unyielding logic of the scientific method. And it was this belief that had kept the memory of her brother's last letter from fading, while her parents, who had passed away years ago, had eventually found a fragile peace in their grief. Lena had never been able to. The official story of pilot error was an unsolved equation in her mind, a conclusion that did not follow from the known variables. The primary variable, the one the Army had never seen, was the letter. It was kept in a small, fireproof box in her study, along with Isaac's medals, his pilot's wings, and the single, devastatingly formal letter of condolence from the War Department. Every year, on the anniversary of his disappearance, she would perform a private, solitary ritual. She would take out the letter and read it. The paper now thin and fragile as a dead leaf. The ink faded, but the words still burning with a cold, clear fire. A rot. A business. I've seen things. These were the words of a man who had discovered a crime, not of a man who was about to commit a fatal error. Her scientific mind, trained to formulate and test hypotheses, had spent 5 decades constructing alternate theories. Had he been sabotaged? Had he been silenced? She had no proof, only the powerful, intuitive certainty of a sister and the cold, analytical doubt of a scientist. In the late 1960s, using the newly passed Freedom of Information Act, she had requested the full accident report on her brother's case. The file she received was shockingly thin, a handful of pages that contained the board's conclusion, a summary of the cursory search, and a transcript of the testimony of a single witness, Staff Sergeant Leland Galloway. Reading his words, so full of coded racist condescension, had made her physically ill. It was the testimony of a biased witness, uncorroborated and self-serving. Yet it had been accepted as the whole truth. It was a perversion of the process of inquiry. She had even, in the early 1980s, hired a private investigator, a retired Air Force OSI agent, to look into the case. He had spent months trying to track down the men who had served at Dale Mabry Field, but the trail was 50 years cold. Most were dead. The few he found had only vague, faded memories. He had found no official record of a Leland Galloway after the war, as if the man had simply vanished. The investigator had concluded, regretfully, that without the discovery of the wreckage itself, the official story, however flawed, could never be challenged. So Lena had learned to live with the silence. The injustice done to her brother's memory had become a part of her, a quiet, constant ache, a source of a profound, private sorrow. She was a woman of evidence, and she had none. She was the sole keeper of a truth that she could not prove, the guardian of a memory that the world had accepted as a lie. She had resigned herself to the fact that she would likely go to her grave with the equation unsolved, the final, true story of her brother's life and death locked away forever in the impenetrable green darkness of a Florida jungle. The Apalachicola National Forest in the Florida Panhandle is a vast, primordial landscape, one of the last great wildernesses of the American South. It is a sprawling, half-million-acre mosaic of longleaf pine forests, cypress swamps, and blackwater rivers, a place where the line between land and water is often a matter of seasonal opinion. For decades, large tracts of its interior had been deemed inaccessible to commercial logging, the ground too swampy and the jungle too thick to make it economically viable. But in the spring of 1992, new technology was prying open these last hidden places. A large timber company, using a combination of high-resolution satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar to map the soil density, was surveying a previously untouched tract of the forest for potential harvesting. The discovery was made not by a man, but by a machine. A team of surveyors was analyzing the radar data from a particularly dense and swampy section of the forest when their computer flagged an anomaly. Deep beneath the surface of the mud and cypress knees, about 6 feet down, the radar had detected a large, dense, metallic object. It was long and vaguely cruciform in shape, utterly alien to the organic geology of the swamp. The surveyors, assuming it was a piece of abandoned, modern logging equipment, a skidder or a bulldozer that had been lost to the swamp years ago, marked the coordinates for a future recovery team. It took another 2 months for that team to arrive. The work was slow and brutal. They had to build a temporary corduroy road to get their heavy equipment into the site. When they finally reached the coordinates, they began to excavate with a backhoe. The bucket scooped up load after load of thick, black, sucking mud. On the third scoop, it struck something hard with a loud, metallic clang. The operator stopped immediately. The crew moved in with shovels, carefully clearing the mud away. What emerged from the black earth was not a bulldozer. It was the wing of an airplane. It was rusted, covered in a half-century of slime, but the iconic tapering shape was unmistakable. And on its surface, faint but still legible under the grime, was the white star in a blue circle of the U.S. Army Air Forces. The work stopped instantly. The site, which had been a commercial logging operation, was now a potential military crash site, a historical grave site. The company immediately notified the authorities. The news of the discovery worked its way up the chain of command, from the local sheriff to the Forest Service, and finally to the Department of Defense. The specific type of aircraft, a Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, and its location were cross-referenced with the military's extensive database of missing aircraft from World War II. They found a single match. The plane belonged to Second Lieutenant Isaac Taylor, a Tuskegee pilot who had vanished on a ferry flight in July of 1942. The 50-year silence of the jungle had been broken by the beep of a radar and the clang of a backhoe's bucket. The discovery was a miracle, a one-in-a-million shot. A piece of history, long thought to be lost forever, had been brought back into the light. And with it, a 50-year-old lie was about to be unearthed. The case of the recovered P-40 Warhawk was officially assigned to the U.S. Army's Central Identification Laboratory in Hawaii, CILA, the precursor to the modern JPAC. The man chosen to lead the recovery and investigation was Major Franklin Hayes of the U.S. Air Force. The assignment was a significant one. Hayes was one of a small, elite group of black officers in the forensic and mortuary affairs community, a man who had built a stellar reputation for his meticulous, scientific approach to identifying the remains of missing service members from past conflicts. For Major Hayes, this was more than just another case. As a modern Air Force pilot himself, a man who had flown F-16s in the Gulf War, he had a deep and profound reverence for the Tuskegee Airmen. They were the giants whose shoulders he stood on, the men who had fought a war on two fronts and had proven, with their skill and their blood, that a black man could fly and fight as well as any man on earth. The opportunity to investigate the final flight of one of these heroes was a sacred duty. He arrived at the crash site in Florida a week after the discovery. The scene was now a secured military operation. The logging company had been moved out, and a perimeter had been established. Hayes's first act was to walk that perimeter, to get a feel for the environment that had held this secret for 50 years. The jungle was a formidable presence, a living, breathing entity of heat, humidity, and decay. He understood immediately why the original search had failed. The canopy was so thick that even standing next to the wreckage, it was almost invisible from just a few yards away. His team, a mix of forensic anthropologists, archaeologists, and explosive ordnance disposal (EOD) technicians, began the slow, painstaking work of an archaeological excavation. The site was gridded off, and the recovery began, not with heavy machinery, but with shovels, trowels, and brushes. This was not a salvage operation, it was a forensic recovery. Every piece of the wreckage, every scrap of metal, every personal effect had a story to tell. Major Hayes's first priority was the cockpit. This was the heart of the mystery, the place where he would find the remains of Lieutenant Taylor and, hopefully, the clues that would explain the cause of the crash. The cockpit was filled with a half-century of compacted mud and vegetation. The work was slow and delicate, the team carefully removing the earth, sifting every handful for bone fragments, for personal effects, for the small, telling details of a man's last moments. While his team worked in the field, Hayes began his own historical investigation. He requested the complete, unredacted accident report from 1942. He read it in his temporary field office, a tent set up at the edge of the site, the humid air thick with the smell of diesel from the generator. As he read the report, with its single biased witness and its swift, convenient conclusion of pilot error, a cold anger began to build in him. The report was a disgrace, a product of an era of casual, systemic racism. It was an insult to the memory of a man who had volunteered to die for his country. He then made a call to a phone number in Washington, D.C. It belonged to Dr. Lena Taylor. He had found her name in the file as the next of kin. He introduced himself, explained the discovery of the wreckage, and asked if she would be willing to speak with him. He heard a sharp, indrawn breath on the other end of the line, followed by a long, profound silence. "Major," Lena Taylor finally said, her voice a mixture of shock and a strange, steely resolve. "I have been waiting for this call for 50 years. She told him about her brother, about his passion, his skill, his patriotism. And then she told him about the last letter, about the rot at Dale Mabry Field, about the cryptic warning that had haunted her for 5 decades. The conversation changed everything for Major Hayes. This was no longer just a historical recovery mission. The letter, a piece of evidence that had been missing from the official record for 50 years, suggested that the flawed investigation of 1942 was not just a matter of prejudice, but a possible cover-up. The jungle had given up the plane. Now it was his job to make it give up the truth. The excavation of the P-40 Warhawk's cockpit was a slow, almost reverent process. Major Hayes and his team worked with the delicate precision of surgeons, knowing they were in a sacred space. After 2 days of carefully removing the compacted mud and debris, they found him. The skeletal remains of Second Lieutenant Isaac Taylor were recovered from the pilot's seat, along with the tattered, rotted remnants of his flight suit and the corroded metal of his harness buckles. The remains were respectfully placed in a transfer case to be flown to the Silhai Lab in Hawaii for positive identification, a process that would be a formality, but a necessary one. With the pilot recovered, the focus of the investigation shifted to the aircraft itself. Hayes's mission was to determine the cause of the crash, to either confirm or refute the 50-year-old finding of pilot error. His team began the arduous task of partially disassembling the wreckage, examining the engine, the control surfaces, the flight systems. The engine showed no signs of a catastrophic mechanical failure. The propeller was bent and twisted from the impact with the trees and the ground, but there was no evidence of an in-flight fire or seizure. The control cables, though corroded, were all intact. The initial findings seemed to suggest that the plane was functioning normally when it went down. This only deepened the mystery. If there was no mechanical failure, what had caused a pilot of Isaac's skill to simply fall out of the sky? The first major bombshell of the investigation came from a young Air Force metallurgist who was examining the fuselage skin just behind the cockpit. He was cleaning a section of the aluminum skin when he noticed a series of small, circular punctures in the metal, arranged in a ragged line. They were not impact tears or corrosion pits. They were too uniform, too round. "Major, you need to see this," he called out, his voice tight with excitement. Hayes came over and knelt in the mud, peering at the holes. There were 5 of them, each about the size of a dime. The metal around the edges of the holes was peeled slightly outwards, the classic signature of an entry hole. He ran his gloved finger over them. He had seen holes like this before, in the wreckage of planes from Vietnam and the Gulf War. He knew exactly what they were. "Get a ballistics team out here," he said, his voice a low, hard command. Now, the ballistics report, delivered 2 days later, was a stunning, case-altering revelation. The holes were confirmed to be bullet holes. The entry angles and the rifling marks on the metal fragments embedded in the fuselage were analyzed. The report was unequivocal. The P-40 Warhawk had been hit from behind and slightly below by a burst of .50 caliber machine gun fire. The finding was a cataclysmic pivot in the investigation. Isaac Taylor had not crashed due to pilot error. He had not been the victim of a mechanical failure. He had been shot down. But the most shocking detail was yet to come. The ballistics team had identified the specific type of ammunition from the unique signature it left on the aluminum. The rounds were M2 armor-piercing incendiary rounds, the standard ammunition used by the U.S. Army Air Forces in World War II. The gun that had fired them was the Browning M2 machine gun, the same type of gun that was mounted in the wings of every P-40 Warhawk, including Isaac's own. The implications were staggering and horrifying. Isaac Taylor had been shot down by another American fighter plane. The 50-year-old story of a tragic accident was not just a lie. It was a cover for an act of murder, a fratricide committed in the skies over Florida. The investigation was no longer a historical inquiry. It was an active homicide case, 50 years cold. The revelation that Isaac Taylor had been shot down by another American plane sent the investigation hurtling in a new and complex direction. Major Hayes now had proof of a crime, but the motive and the identity of the killer were a 50-year-old mystery. The most logical and most charitable explanation was a tragic friendly fire incident. The new prevailing theory was that Isaac, on his solo ferry flight, had accidentally strayed into an active live-fire training zone. In the confusion of a mock dogfight, another pilot had mistaken his plane for a target drone and had opened fire. It was a scenario that was tragically plausible in the chaotic, high-pressure environment of wartime training. To prove this theory, Hayes needed to place another plane in the sky with Isaac on that fateful day. He and his small team of researchers began a deep, frustrating dive into the declassified military archives, specifically looking for the operational records of Dale Mabry Field for July of 1942. The records were a bureaucratic nightmare. They were incomplete, poorly organized, and stored on thousands of pages of brittle, fading microfilm. The work was a slow, eye-straining process of sifting through a mountain of historical data. They searched for any mention of a live-fire gunnery exercise scheduled for the day of Isaac's disappearance. After weeks of searching, they found it. A faded daily flight schedule that listed a 2-plane training mission for a pair of pilots from a white squadron, designated to practice aerial gunnery in a restricted zone over the Gulf of Mexico, miles away from Isaac's inland flight path. This discovery, while intriguing, seemed to weaken the training accident theory. If the exercise was over the Gulf, how could it have intersected with Isaac's flight over the Apalachicola Forest? Hayes, however, was a meticulous investigator. He kept digging. He cross-referenced the flight schedule with the individual pilot logs for that day, if they could be found. He found the log for one of the pilots, a Lieutenant Miller. His log was routine, but the log for the second pilot, a Lieutenant Jameson, was missing from the archives, a common occurrence in the chaotic record-keeping of the era. The trail seemed to have gone cold. The training accident was a compelling theory, but he had no definitive proof, no way to link the plane from the gunnery exercise to Isaac's flight. The investigation began to focus on the human element. Hayes started building a file on the pilots and ground crew who were stationed at Dale Mabry Field in the summer of 1942. He was trying to understand the social and racial dynamics of the base. He interviewed the handful of surviving Tuskegee airmen who had passed through Dale Mabry. They painted a grim picture. The base was a hotbed of racial tension. The white officers and enlisted men, they said, treated them with a mixture of contempt and open hostility. The Tuskegee pilots were often subjected to sabotage, with ground crews putting sand in their fuel tanks or cutting their control cables. This new information added another layer of complexity to the friendly fire theory. Was it possible that the shoot-down was not an accident? Was it a deliberate, racially motivated act of murder, disguised as a training mishap? The idea was monstrous, but in the context of the virulent racism of the era, it was not impossible. The investigation had reached a critical juncture. Hayes had two plausible, but unproven theories. A tragic accident, or a premeditated racist murder. Both scenarios were horrifying, but they were fundamentally different crimes. He was missing a piece of evidence that could tell him which path to follow. He was missing the motive. The answer, he felt, was not in the sky. It was on the ground, in the rot that Isaac Taylor had written about in his final letter. He instructed his team at the crash site to begin a final, microscopic sift of the remaining contents of the cockpit. He was looking for a ghost, a clue that had been hidden in the mud for 50 years. The final phase of the excavation at the crash site was a slow, almost microscopic process. Major Hayes's team, working under the oppressive Florida heat, treated the remaining contents of the cockpit like a precious archaeological find. The mud and debris were carefully removed, placed in buckets, and then washed through a series of fine mesh screens, a technique designed to catch even the smallest, most insignificant-seeming object. For days, the screens yielded only the expected fragments: shattered pieces of bakelite from the instrument panel, corroded brass fittings, a single, tarnished uniform button. It was the painstaking, unglamorous work of a cold case investigation. The breakthrough came from a young Air Force archaeologist who was sifting the contents recovered from the small, cramped space behind the pilot's seat. Her screen caught something large and rectangular. It was a metal box, about the size of a shoebox, and it was crushed almost flat, mangled by the force of the crash. It was a standard-issue footlocker, a place where a pilot would store personal items and logbooks. The discovery sent a wave of excitement through the team. The footlocker was carefully stabilized and flown to the JPAC lab in Hawaii. The lab's conservation team worked for a week, using specialized tools to gently pry open the crushed, corroded metal without damaging the contents. Inside, they found a miracle of preservation. The anaerobic mud had acted as a perfect seal, protecting the contents from the ravages of oxygen and decay. The interior was a sodden, pulpy mass of what had once been paper. The lab's document restoration specialists began the delicate, almost impossible task of separating and preserving the waterlogged pages. They used freeze-drying techniques and infrared imaging to stabilize the fragile paper and make the faded ink legible. The first document they managed to restore was Isaac Taylor's personal flight logbook. Its pages were a testament to his skill and professionalism, with neat, precise entries detailing every flight, every maneuver, every hour he had spent in the sky. But it was what was tucked into a leather sleeve in the back of the logbook that would provide the second and most profound forensic bombshell of the investigation. It was a single sheet of paper, a carbon copy of an official Army supply manifest. The document was dated July 15, 1942, the day before Isaac's final flight. It was from the Dale Mabry Field Supply Depot, and it was signed at the bottom by the NCO in charge, Staff Sergeant Leland Galloway. The manifest detailed a massive shipment of a single crucial item: 0 vials of penicillin. Major Hayes, when he saw the document, immediately understood its significance. In 1942, penicillin was a new revolutionary miracle drug. It was more valuable than gold on the front lines, a substance that could mean the difference between life and a battlefield death from a simple infection. The manifest indicated that this massive, priceless shipment was being loaded onto a transport plane destined for the Allied forces fighting in North Africa. But something about the manifest felt wrong to Hayes. Why would a pilot, even an observant one, have a copy of a supply document for a shipment he wasn't involved with? It was a piece of evidence that didn't belong. Acting on a hunch, Hayes made a call to the Army's Quartermaster Corps archives. He asked them to search their records for any official documentation of a penicillin shipment from Dale Mabry Field to North Africa in July of 1942. The call back from the archives came 2 days later. The archivist's voice was puzzled. "Major, we've searched every shipping log, every medical supply record for that entire theater of operations," he said. "There's no record of that shipment. It never arrived in North Africa. In fact, there's no official record of it ever having been sent. According to our files, that shipment of penicillin never existed." The manifest was a forgery. The 50-year-old piece of paper, preserved in the mud, was the proof of the rot that Isaac Taylor had written about. He hadn't just suspected that something was wrong at the supply depot. He had found the evidence. Staff Sergeant Leland Galloway was not just a racist NCO, he was a traitor, stealing life-saving medicine from his own soldiers to sell on the lucrative black market. And Isaac Taylor was the man who had found him out. The friendly fire theory, the training accident, it was all a red herring. This was a murder for profit, a cold-blooded execution to silence a witness. The forged penicillin manifest was the key that unlocked the entire 50-year-old mystery. It was the motive, cold, hard, and treasonous, printed in faded ink on a fragile piece of paper. Major Franklin Hayes now understood the true nature of the crime he was investigating. This was not a story about a tragic accident or a racially motivated killing in the heat of the moment. This was the story of a sophisticated criminal enterprise and a cold-blooded murder, orchestrated to protect a stream of illegal profits. He sat in his temporary office, the humid Florida night pressing in, and began to construct the final, true theory of the crime. He laid out the evidence on a large table: Isaac's last letter, the forged manifest, the ballistics report on the bullet holes, and the incomplete flight logs from the day of the disappearance. The narrative began with Isaac Taylor, a man who was not just a pilot, but a keen and intelligent observer. During his layover at Dale Mabry Field, his sharp eyes had noticed something wrong. Perhaps he saw crates being loaded onto an unmarked civilian truck late at night. Perhaps he overheard a conversation he wasn't supposed to hear. His suspicions aroused, he had done some quiet investigating of his own. Being a black officer in a segregated army gave him a kind of invisibility. The white enlisted men in the supply depot would have paid him no mind, allowing him to see the inner workings of their corrupt system. Somehow, he had managed to obtain a copy of Galloway's forged manifest, the hard evidence he needed to prove his suspicions. He now had proof of a massive black market operation, run by the base's own supply sergeant. "This is where the timeline becomes critical," Hayes explained to his team. "Isaac has this document. He knows he's sitting on a bombshell." The most likely scenario, Hayes theorized, was that Isaac, a man of immense integrity and a deep sense of duty, had decided to confront Galloway directly. It was a brave, but naive, move. He would have underestimated the ruthlessness of the man he was dealing with. He likely went to Galloway on the morning of his departure, presented him with the evidence, and told him he was going to report it to the base commander. For Staff Sergeant Leland Galloway, this was a moment of absolute crisis. He was not just a thief. He was a traitor. selling life-saving medicine while his countrymen were dying overseas. Exposure would mean a court-martial and, very likely, a firing squad, and the man who held his life in his hands was a young, black pilot, a man who, in Galloway's racist worldview, was his inferior, a man who had no right to challenge him. Galloway, a shrewd and calculating criminal, would have seen only one way out. He couldn't silence Isaac on the ground. There would be too many witnesses. He had to silence him in the sky. This is where the conspiracy begins, Hayes continued, his voice low and intense. Galloway can't shoot down the plane himself. He needs an accomplice. He needs a pilot. He pointed to the incomplete flight logs from the gunnery training exercise. He finds his man here, a white pilot, someone loyal to him, someone he has leverage over, perhaps another player in his black market ring, or someone with a gambling debt. He goes to this pilot and gives him an order. An experimental Negro pilot is going to be flying over your training sector. He's a suspected sympathizer. Your orders are to intercept and eliminate. Make it look like an accident. It was a perfect, diabolical plan. Galloway would use the official, sanctioned violence of a training exercise as the cover for a premeditated murder. He would use the systemic racism of the military as his most powerful weapon, knowing that the word of a white pilot against a dead black one would never be questioned. The rest of the story wrote itself. Isaac Taylor takes off on his flight, unaware of the trap that has been set. The accomplice pilot, flying under the guise of a routine training mission, intercepts him. He comes up from behind and below, the classic fighter pilot's attack position, and fires a single deadly burst from his .50 caliber machine guns. Isaac's P-40, mortally wounded, spirals into the dense, impenetrable jungle. The accomplice returns to base and files a false report of an accidental discharge of his weapons, a minor mechanical issue that is noted and forgotten. Galloway, his secret safe, continues his treasonous enterprise. The perfect crime. With the full scope of the conspiracy now clear, Major Hayes's investigation narrowed to a singular critical task, identifying the pilot who had pulled the trigger. He had the motive and the means. He needed the second man. The key, he knew, was in the incomplete and frustratingly vague records of the Dale Mabry Field gunnery exercise. He focused his attention on the one surviving document, the daily flight schedule. It listed 2 pilots assigned to the training mission that day. A oneist Lieutenant Miller, whose routine flight log they had already found, and a twined lieutenant named Warren Russell, whose log was missing. Russell was now the primary person of interest. The investigation became a genealogical and historical manhunt. Hayes tasked his research team at JPAC with building a complete profile of Warren Russell. They started with his military service record. Russell, they discovered, was a young, aggressive pilot with a reputation for being a hothead. He had a disciplinary file that included several reprimands for reckless flying and insubordination. He was not a model officer. More significantly, his record showed that he was transferred out of Dale Mabry Field just a week after Isaac Taylor's disappearance, a sudden reassignment that was unusual for a pilot in the middle of a training cycle. The team then began the arduous process of tracking Russell's life after the war. He had been discharged in 1945 and had returned to his home state of Mississippi. He had worked a series of odd jobs before seemingly vanishing from all official records in the late 1950s. There was no death certificate, no social security records, no credit history. It was as if he had become a ghost. This disappearance was, to Hayes, a significant clue. Men with clean consciences do not typically erase themselves from existence. It suggested a man on the run, a man haunted by a secret. While the search for Russell continued, Hayes turned his attention back to the mastermind, Leland Galloway. He needed to find him, to see if the man who had signed the forged manifest 50 years ago was still alive. This search was more difficult. Galloway was a common name, and as an enlisted man, his records were less detailed. But Hayes's team was relentless. They sifted through post-war census records, VA hospital databases, and property deeds. After weeks of painstaking work, they found him. Leland Galloway had changed his name after the war, adopting his mother's maiden name. He had used the immense profits from his black market operation to establish himself as a legitimate businessman. He was now Leland Bishop, the wealthy, retired owner of a large shipping company in Jacksonville, Florida. He was 82 years old, a pillar of his community, a man whose life of quiet, respectable luxury was built on a foundation of treason and murder. The discovery of both Galloway and the ghost of Warren Russell provided Hayes with the framework for the end of his investigation. But he still needed a direct link, a piece of evidence that could tie the two men together on that specific day. He decided to take a long shot. He requested the maintenance logs for the aircraft assigned to the gunnery exercise. He was looking for the report on the accidental discharge of Lieutenant Russell's machine guns. The records were in terrible condition, but after days of searching, an archivist found it, a single, greasy maintenance form. It detailed the inspection of Russell's P-40 after he had reported the malfunction. The report was signed by the crew chief, but at the bottom of the form was a second signature, an authorizing signature that was not required by protocol. It was the signature of the NCO, in charge of the supply depot, the man who controlled the parts and the maintenance schedules. The signature was clear and legible. S. Sergeant L. Galloway. Hayes stared at the signature. It was the final, damning link. Galloway had not just given the order, he had personally supervised the cover-up, ensuring that the mechanical fault was officially documented and then buried in the bureaucracy. He had tied up the loose end. He had signed his name on the final page of his perfect crime. The signature of Staff Sergeant Leland Galloway on the maintenance report for Lieutenant Warren Russell's P-40 was the final, crucial piece of documentary evidence Major Hayes needed. It was the irrefutable link between the mastermind and the triggerman. It placed Galloway in direct, personal supervision of the cover-up of the very event that had killed Isaac Taylor. The 50-year-old flight and maintenance logs, which had been designed to create a false narrative, were now the very documents that exposed the truth. Hayes now had the complete, unbroken chain of the conspiracy. He had Isaac's letter, which established his knowledge of the rot. He had the forged penicillin manifest, which was the proof of that rot and the motive for the murder. He had the ballistics report, which proved Isaac had been shot down by another American plane. He had the flight schedule, which placed Warren Russell in the air on a gunnery mission on the same day. And now, he had Galloway's signature, the documentary proof that he had personally overseen the whitewashing of Russell's accidental discharge. The investigation into the life and disappearance of Warren Russell had also yielded a final, tragic piece of the puzzle. An analyst, searching through old digitized newspapers from Mississippi, found a small article from 1958. It was a brief report on a single-car accident on a remote country road. The driver, who had been killed instantly, was identified as Warren Russell. The local sheriff had ruled the accident a result of drunk driving. But reading between the lines, Hayes saw a different story. Russell had been a ghost for a decade after the war, a man haunted by his actions. His death felt less like an accident and more like the final, self-destructive act of a man who could no longer live with what he had done. He was a loose end that had, in the end, tied itself. With Russell dead, the entire weight of the crime now rested on one man, Leland Galloway. Hayes began to assemble his final case file. It was a document that spanned 50 years, a story told through a young pilot's last letter, a forged manifest, a ballistics report, and a series of faded bureaucratic forms. It was a case that would have been impossible to prove in 1942, a world where the word of a white sergeant would always have outweighed the suspicions of a black pilot's family. But in 1992, the science and the documents told a different, more powerful story. Before he made his final move, Hayes made one last call to Dr. Lena Taylor. He walked her through the entire investigation, from the discovery of the bullet holes to the final, damning signature on the maintenance log. He told her his complete theory of the crime, that her brother had uncovered a treasonous black market ring, had been murdered to silence him, and that his killer had used a fellow pilot and the cover of a training exercise to commit the perfect crime. On the other end of the line, there was a long, profound silence. Lena absorbed the information, not with shock, but with a deep, weary sense of vindication. "So I was right," she said. Her voice, a quiet, trembling whisper. "It was never an accident. They murdered him, and they let the world believe he was a failure." "Yes, ma'am," Hayes said softly. "They did, but they made one mistake. They didn't count on your brother being a hero. He left the evidence behind, and they didn't count on us finding it." He told her what was about to happen next, that he was taking the case file to the Department of Justice, that they would be seeking an arrest warrant for a man named Leland Galloway, now Leland Bishop, for the murder of a U.S. Army officer in a time of war. The 50-year-old lie, so carefully constructed and so long protected by the silence of the jungle and the prejudice of the past, was about to be confronted with the truth. The arrest of Leland Galloway took place on a sunny Tuesday morning in a wealthy, gated community in Jacksonville, Florida. The man who answered the door of the sprawling waterfront mansion was a handsome, silver-haired octogenarian, his face tan and unlined, the picture of a man who had lived a long and prosperous life. He looked at the two FBI agents and the uniformed Air Force major on his doorstep with an expression of mild, aristocratic annoyance. "There must be some mistake," he said, his voice a smooth, confident baritone. "My name is Leland Bishop. We know who you are, Staff Sergeant Galloway," Major Hayes said, his voice cold and even. He handed the man the arrest warrant. The charge was for the murder of Second Lieutenant Isaac Taylor in July of 1942. The color drained from the old man's face. The confident mask he had worn for 50 years dissolved, revealing the terrified, cornered thief he had been on that day at Dale Mabry Field. He didn't speak. He simply sagged, a frail old man suddenly crushed by the weight of a crime he thought he had outrun. Faced with the mountain of irrefutable evidence, the forged manifest, the flight logs, the confession of the other pilot's son, who remembered his father's drunken, guilt-ridden ramblings about the shoot-down, Galloway's high-priced lawyers advised him to confess in exchange for a lesser sentence. In a sterile deposition room, the 82-year-old man, his voice a dry, cracking whisper, admitted to the entire conspiracy. He recounted his confrontation with the young, idealistic black pilot who had threatened to undo his entire enterprise. He admitted to ordering the shoot-down, his words a chilling, unrepentant narrative of a crime committed with a cold, businesslike efficiency. He showed no remorse, only the bitterness of a man whose perfect crime had been undone by a ghost from the past. The final act of the story belongs to Dr. Lena Taylor. A month later, a small, formal ceremony was held at the Pentagon. Lena, now 70 years old, stood with her son and grandchildren in the office of the Secretary of the Air Force. Major Franklin Hayes stood beside her. The secretary read a formal citation, officially striking the finding of pilot error from Isaac Taylor's record. He spoke of Isaac's bravery, his integrity, and his ultimate sacrifice, not in a tragic accident, but in the act of uncovering treason. He then presented Lena with 2 medals on behalf of a grateful nation. The first was the Purple Heart. The second, the nation's 3rd highest award for valor, was the Distinguished Flying Cross. Major Hayes then handed her a small, flag-draped box. Inside were her brother's pilot's wings, recovered from the cockpit and carefully restored. She took the box, her hands trembling slightly. She looked at the silver wings, and the 50 years of silence, of doubt, of a sister's unwavering belief, finally came to an end. Later that day, she stood with Major Hayes at the newly dedicated Tuskegee Airman Memorial. She told him about her brother, about his passion for flight, about his dream of a world where he would be judged not by the color of his skin, but by the quality of his character. "He was a hero, Dr. Taylor," Hayes said quietly. "He was a hero long before he ever climbed into that cockpit. It just took the rest of us 50 years to find the evidence." Lena looked up at the sky. A vast, brilliant blue, the kind of sky her brother had loved to fly in. The pain of his loss was still there, a permanent part of her, but it was now joined by a new, profound sense of peace. The injustice had been corrected. The lie had been silenced. Her brother's name and his legacy were finally and forever cleared for takeoff.